Considering the value added by avatars, why wouldn't we design both training and conferencing from the avatar's perspective and take full advantage of tapping into the psychology of avatars? This panel session will address questions like this and provide empirical evidence for utilizing avatar psychology for virtual worlds and education. Our panel leader has over 25 years of experience and has published several books on avatar psychology. He has most recently served as the designer and the professor for the Certificate in Virtual Worlds program at the University of Washington and is the CEO of 2B3D, an immersive web solutions company. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present Mr. Randy Heinrichs.
It's great to be here. It's great to see you again. I don't get the opportunity to see you very often as a real person, so I know your avatar very well. I know Kevin's avatar and David's avatar as well. Kevin Holloway, Dr. Kevin Holloway from the Center for Deployment Psychology will be joining the panel as well. And Dr. David Metcalf from the University of Central Florida, the Mixed Emerging Technology Labs, director of very fascinating place where we'll be talking a little bit about some of the software that he's developed. But we have a question. We want to take the conversation into the avatar's head, into the learner's head, and start talking about the psychology of the avatar. We have a very basic question. Are you your avatar? Do you trust, do people trust your avatar? Do you trust other people that are avatars? In simulations, your avatars are anthropomorphic cursors, basically. But in virtual worlds, your avatars are representations of who you are. Avatar studies at Stanford show that taller avatars negotiate better and win more often. Avatars that portray themselves as older people in virtual worlds invest more money in their stock portfolio than younger ones. And even avatars step back from you when you get too close. So there's something going on here that's unconscious, psychological reactions in the environment. They're also conscious in decisions that are being made in the environment as well. And we want to take a look at those conscious efforts like managing people's attention when you're moving in the environment. So I have a question. Can you move to the next slide, please? If you are attending a conference in a virtual world at a historically black college, should you show up as a black avatar? Are there advantages for doing that? Is that the right thing to do? Is that the ethical thing to do if it gives you an advantage? If you are in a wheelchair and you're developing a virtual world and other people appear in the virtual world, should you build ramps for the environment so that people can go up into their environment? Should you accommodate for the psychology? So what we're looking here is the longer that you spend in a virtual world, the more you're going to have to address these issues and the more you're going to react to these issues. And we find there are 4 cognitive stages that are developing in the environment. The first one, and all dependent upon how long you spend there, is this whole sense of presence. What avatars basically do in their first 10 hours in the environment is that they demonstrate some level of intelligence. Then they start to perform more effectively because they understand how the environment works. So 20 to 30 hours in, they're starting to manipulate objects. Soon they begin to form an identity, and as Kevin and I heard at a restaurant last night, the waiter heard our conversation was very upset about somebody stole his avatar in World of Warcraft that his sister told him about, and he rushed home. He got off his job, rushed home, called Blizzard, and tried to figure out what happened to me, he said. And we were interested in listening to him talk about himself for a long period of time until he finally resolved that he lost the avatar and he started calling it it. And we thought that was very interesting. The next stage, when avatars are in these environments for a long period of time, they begin to work together in communities, and they assist each other in accomplishing tasks. Could I have the next slide, please? I'm just going to show you some basic examples, and then I'm going to turn the microphone over to Kevin, where he'll be framing up as a psychologist a little bit of what I'm talking about from another perspective. Software that demonstrates this, but go ahead and take a look at Lucasfilm's Habitat in 1985, just an example of presence when people are going, whoop, like in South Park, you're here. Oh yes, I'm And that's really all the interaction that happened in here, except for some chatting was going along. However, Chip Morningstar and Randy Farmer asked themselves the question, if we only knew that we were going to be managing a government by the time this thing was finished, we would have designed this thing entirely different, because that's what Lucasfilm's Habitat turned into. The next stage of the avatar, if you'll go to the next slide, please, is when people become interactive in the environment, in the sense that they're sitting there and they're participating in meetings, they're going to conferences, they're watching the performer communicate with some symbols on the board, writing on a whiteboard or doing a presentation like we're doing, but they're doing this as an observer, and they're becoming part of the environment, but they can perform now. They can go and manage their workflow, they can interact with each other and communicate. And quite honestly, this is where I think that the sequestration is going to take everybody into virtual worlds like this and conducting their experiences as before. Next slide, please. But then you cross over all of a sudden and you start developing this whole sense of identity that that's me. I would be very lost if I weren't that person on the left-hand side showing up in my University of Washington class every Thursday for 3 hours. And as I tried, I asked my students to come and sit and listen to me talk when I arrived as a peacock, and I lost my authority. They lost their attention because this is the person that they think is their professor. And I think that's me as well. So Coco is another type of an avatar that is the next reach into the type of icons that are being used to identify people's identity. But do you know what these people are thinking? Our psychology is working in the background, but our technology is not working in the foreground. And in these presentations that we've seen throughout the week, we've seen different types of technology that are now going to be doing face recognition, capturing eye gaze, looking at people's hands and their body gestures. Next slide, please. What people are doing is, I noticed all the virtual world challenges were in Second Life, which was a big surprise to me since Bruce Joy had said that it had failed. It's kind of amazing to me that museums are existing in this world, that training programs are going on in this world, and all it really is Kleenex and Jell-O and Xerox, right? It's just a virtual world that's working, but I think that it demonstrates that some of these things that I'm talking about, that community really does happen in this environment. And memory increases in this environment. These kids in the middle are involved in a study when they were swimming with dolphins in a virtual world or whales in a virtual world, and they actually remember in conversation that they were swimming there like they were really there. So in their conversations, when they explained to their teachers that they were swimming with whales last night, in their mind they were. So what's happening in the youth's mind is really interesting. Not to mention the fact that the doppelganger effect is really having its impact in advertising. So if people see their avatar as they have a strong identity with their avatar using a product in a virtual world, they'll tend to go buy that product in the physical world, which is pretty fascinating. Next slide, please. Last but not least, when you finally get to this level, this cognitive level of a real engagement in these environments, and you're using your avatar like you're following somebody when they're talking, you're using gestures to shake your head to indicate some of the things that you can't do when you're in the environment. Like you say, I have to have a face-to-face meeting. But the reason that you have to have a face-to-face meeting is because you're getting all of this explicit information that's coming out of the individual when you're talking to them. How do you do that in a virtual world, since we're pretty much being forced to operate in these global environments? In the health industry, they are having you compete with each other physically, like when you wear a Fitbit and you're running on a Wii like this, and you're competing with other people doing the same thing in the environment. When you begin these kind of community engagement activities, something again is really happening at a deep level, and you're seeing these neuroplastic effects happen. Not to mention that we're probably going to be developing not just buildings in virtual worlds and classrooms and meeting rooms, but we're going to start co-designing things like the human body, like the atomic structure, like DNA, and we're going to be in there bringing our expertise as avatars, building these things together. And my last slide is just basically saying, but where we are right now is not really deeply in this virtual world. We're only looking at it like could you go to the next slide, please? Like we want to be there. Instead, we're looking at more text, and we're all enamored by these things called MOOCs, where we're reaching out, we're saying now we have access to content. What we really need access to is engagement, interactivity, and recognition that the other person is really and truly there. I think that when you start operating more frequently in a virtual world, like you'll see in the panel, you'll see the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand it over to Kevin and get his reaction to this as a psychologist.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kevin Holloway. I'm a clinical psychologist and work for the Center for Employment Psychology in Rockville, which is kind of near Bethesda. I don't have any slides. Partly because I really wanted to think more about and respond more to just kind of how the panel unfolds and what the discussion comes up with. So I've had a couple of thoughts. As you know, Randy and I certainly have talked a lot previously. We've had, I don't know, how many hours would you estimate? Hundreds, thousands of hours just discussing all this kind of stuff. We worked together on a few previous projects. And as a psychologist, I'm always interested in how technology can be leveraged to help people's mental health. So I work mostly with service members in the DoD, particularly those who have returned from combat and are suffering from anxiety disorders, PTSD, and other related things. In fact, if you were in here in the last session, Dr. Bedell talked about a virtual reality system for treating PTSD, and it was fantastic. It's like, wow, this is a speech I've given 100 times. I love seeing it from another point of view, so it's great. And so one of the questions that always comes up to me is when thinking about applications in a virtual environment, particularly in the context of medical or psychological health issues, what rights does an avatar have? And particularly, in the light of what Randy's presenting as kind of this phase progression of being in that environment or being that avatar. What rights come with that? Do those change at the different phases? Are they dependent on the context and what you're doing in there? And I mean, that's probably one of those really way too easy, sure questions. But and I'll tell you what, I've been thinking about that a lot. Peter Yelovese out of UC Davis, I don't know how many of you know who he is. He's a psychiatrist that several years ago wanted to kind of improve his teaching for his psychiatry students, wanted to help them understand psychopathology better, and developed an environment that, by today's standards, looks terribly old school and clunky graphics and such. I don't know if it's even still there, but he built it in Second Life called the virtual hallucination. And the idea was to help his students going through this learn what it might actually feel like to have schizophrenia, psychosis, hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations. And it was an incredibly effective teaching tool for his students. He worked a lot with actual psychotic patients to help them get it right, to make sure that experience reflected what these patients had been experiencing. It was fantastic. But it got him also thinking about the same thing. So we had these great conversations about, so if you're going to actually do psychological interventions in a space like this, if you're going to use a virtual environment as an extension or a tool of your therapy, what rights does the avatar have? Well, we certainly have lots of codes and laws and ethical guidelines around what rights a patient has. And, for example, the right to confidentiality and privacy of their information. They have a right that the work that's being done is for their best interest primarily. They certainly have a right not to be harmed. And there's all sorts of things. Do those just automatically extend to the avatar or not? And the problem is that, of course, none of our ethical standards or laws or requirements have taken that into account. When you're on the cutting edge, nobody's thought about what your concerns are at. So he posed it as a very interesting question. I think he actually got this from somebody else, so I wish I had that reference on him right now. This is why you should have slides. But he posed it as, well, what rights does a prosthetic leg have? That's an interesting, provocative question. I almost want to kind of just throw it out there. What do you guys think? What rights does a prosthetic leg have? Or wow, how is that relevant? Yeah.
Well, it has none in the closet, but when you're wearing it, it has all the attributes of yours, which imply rights to either be affected or to affect others. Absolutely,
and that's really what he came down to. So for those of you who didn't hear that, the prosthetic leg has no rights in the closet, right? It's a piece of property. But when it's attached to the person, it kind of becomes an extension of that person, and therefore all the rights that are with that person get extended to it as well. So if you think about somebody who goes in and actually savagely attacks, and why somebody would do this, I don't know, but savagely attacks the prosthetic leg attached to a person, legally that's assault, right? I mean, really. The person would be charged with assault because they attacked this person, even if they only attacked the prosthetic leg. What if they did the same thing while it was in the closet?
Damaged property.
That's just damaged property, right? Exactly. And in some ways, he said, this is a really apt metaphor for the avatar. We're talking about, in some ways, an electronic prosthetic. That this is, as it's attached to a person, as it is being manipulated, controlled, moved by a living person behind it, then it comes with all the rights that are afforded to the person sitting behind it. When it's detached from it, whether it's either offline, of course, or when it's being run by a script or whatever it may be, then it really changes the nature of what those rights are. So, anyway, thinking a lot about that and how that applies, we're just throwing that out there as something to think about. We don't really hear discussions about what's the psychology of the avatar, or what rights does an avatar have and such, partly because I think we just usually assume that it is the person. This is just, a way to communicate. Yeah.
Something I hope you'll address today ties back to what Rand said a moment ago, and that's relating to the avatar when not in use.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone, in this case, attacks the system around your avatar to get that identity, well, what rights does an avatar have when it's not in use or in the closet? Because I think it's very different from the prosthetic leg in this case.
Certainly. So to extend our metaphor way too far, when somebody removes my prosthetic leg from my closet and straps it onto themselves, now what? And I'm throwing, I don't know that I have the answer. I'm throwing it out there for all of you.
It's stealing.
What's that?
Essentially, it's stealing.
So it's stolen property, okay, but as it's attached to that person and they're giving it motion and movement and purpose, is maybe that, what's changed? Why doesn't it have the same rights as when it was attached to me?
It's replaceable and it doesn't have its own identity unless
Okay.
it's so specifically built for you that people identify you by that very prosthetic device.
So now we're getting into areas of reputation and identity and how a person is identified through their avatar. Absolutely. So in the case of the seriously, we had this waiter come in, I think it was 2 hours. He'd gotten off of his shift and he sat there for 2 hours talking to us about all these things. We were discussing some of these ideas last night. And, if he's logged out, somebody hacked his account and somebody's running around in his avatar in World of Warcraft, it's not the same as just attaching on the leg anymore, right? Because now what he's doing, it's not just stealing property, it's not just stealing electronic property, gold, and the drops of the weapons. He referred to that a couple of times, the missed opportunities of the raids that happened while his account was shut down. And I only really marginally understand what that means because I haven't played World of Warcraft. Terrible confession. But I know. That is going, what? So I need to get now. But now it's also potentially damaging to the identity and the reputation and the status that this avatar had before. That is only relevant when it's attached to its original owner. So, Randy told an interesting story earlier today, I think it was, when he popped into one of his class projects as a different avatar than he normally uses.
Well, this is what the question keeps coming back to is where do some of these issues lie, like trust. I had a student who pretty much guards our island, and I dropped down as another avatar to test it as a work avatar, so I was coming in there not as a University of Washington person. And as I landed there, she confronted me and she said, "Who are you?" And I don't know why I did this, but I told her I was Rand's father. And so I had to have this conversation with her that I had to make up, and so I was feeling worse and worse and worse because I realized I was breaching her trust. And finally I popped down as Rand, and I looked for a very smooth way to convince her that, okay, Dad, go back into the car and go home now. You're not supposed to be talking to my students. And, did I steal myself? And that's why Kevin's question is extremely relevant. And now I'd love to throw this question out because a lot of people have to answer this question. Are you your avatar? Do you believe you are your avatar? Why not?
No.
Go ahead.
No, I am. I'm my avatar both in Second Life, I'm my avatar in World of Warcraft, I'm my avatar in all of the areas. We're thinking about getting my new customization, personalization, the immersion, the transference that occurs is almost instantaneous. And I hurt, I get scared, I bleed for it. And Sierra, when the guild and the team does their thing, and you're part of the group, absolutely.
So as an advanced avatar, because you're way more than 30 hours in it, or way more than 90 hours in it, do you feel obligated to show euphoria and to show pain as an avatar?
I don't feel obligated, it happens naturally.
That's interesting.
Kind of an extension of you.
It is.
It is definitely.
Had you ever thought?
No, I was an avid World of Warcraft player too, and I had the same thing happen. Somebody had stolen one of my other teenage sons. One of his friends had gotten our account, and he went in and stole not only my character and all the gold, all the possessions I had. I mean, there was a real loss. It was not just a game.
And it's not just the monetary loss either.
No, absolutely not. I mean, you feel violated. I mean, it is definitely an extension of yourself. And even though I don't play anymore, I still see it. And it's not just Warcraft. It's any of that user environments, community. I definitely see transformation of people after they play it long enough. You do identify. Especially when you have something so advanced as Warcraft, where you do have that customization. And then it gets real personal, real fast.
And the counterpoint to that, because you raised your hand and said, no, I'm not.
Well, okay, so I'm not a World of Warcraft player. I did that up front too. I do have a Mii on my Nintendo Wii at home. Okay, so I'm used to the other experience. But let me give you kind of an analogy I was thinking of here. What if I have a document that I wrote of personal nature on Google Docs, a cloud environment, and someone steals that and publishes it as their own, or changes it, or make up your favorite analogy or scenario here? How much different is that? I mean, there's a real sense of loss. It could be damaging to my reputation, right? It could be monetary loss. How different is that than having an avatar happen?
I think that's an incredibly good example, and I think maybe the example I'd throw back at you, maybe to further confuse us all, is a good friend of mine is working on a project right now. It's a kind of a joint project between DoD and VA to provide some education for mental health providers online, some on-demand stuff. And I won't tell you what the project is or anything yet because I don't want to jinx it. But she comes to me daily and she's lamenting. She's like, "This is such a train wreck. This is going to be this horrible problem partly because these two systems don't speak the same language, the VA and the DoD, and there's some real difficulties in communicating between the two systems." And she said, "I've got to take my name off of this."
Right. So another example, real quick, from St. Louis. Okay, and a lot of people in St. Louis are huge baseball fans. When they talk about the St. Louis Cardinals, it's we, it's not they, right? And they have a real personal identity. And when the Cardinals lost Game 7 of the NLCS last year, there's a distinct feeling that was a personal experience as well. So when I identify with some group in that way, how different is that than the connection it feels to an avatar?
I mean, it's a great question, and I don't know that, personally, I don't have an answer for that.
Who's your guild?
Right.
Right.
And we may even say that there isn't a perfect delineation, right?
Right, and so my point is
Right.
this avatar experience you're talking about really conceptually, a real paradigm shift from the kinds of connections people have made to communities or to property of other kinds as well.
Well, some ways I would say that's kind of the point, right? I mean, this isn't really a new phenomenon. We're identifying very heavily here, we're investing ourselves very heavily here. And I think maybe the place where it might be slightly different is that this is representing my identity, not just my relationships.
But isn't your invented identity? I mean, if you
That's a great
actually
point.
put avatars on a human scale, they're 6'7". I mean, they're not real people. They're not scaled to
I'm
real
really
people.
tall at Second Life, by the way.
Everybody's really tall.
Except what's really, I think what this has done, this anthropomorphization of ourself on the internet with an avatar, it's really brought up the question, what is our collective identity on the internet, right? And it's pretty much got to be the same as my collective identity in the physical world because I project information DNA-wise and cultural-wise and education-wise. And I want that to be trusted over the internet everywhere. And right now, part of me is a Google Doc, and part of me is a Facebook, and part of me is an iPhone identity. But these things are merging together, and I think the avatars made us think like this really deeply all of a sudden. I want to make sure that I give David time to go into his stuff so you can see what happens when we really start to design around the psychology of the avatar and pull all of these things together and ask ourselves, are we our avatar, and if so, then what?
I'm going to step over here. My job is oftentimes to try and embody some of these psychological principles into the technology that's going to be used to deploy this. So I want to show you a few examples of what that might look like and walk through those just very quickly so that we can maybe use those to bounce off of and do some reflectivity on. So we'll just come up here. Show that. There we go. So again, I'm at UCF, the Mixed Emerging Technology Integration Lab. We do a lot of projects that involve learning, performance, and well-being as outcomes. So we're looking at how the psychology of what we do is affected by the outcomes. And oftentimes our projects involve some of the best psychology out of team-based learning and performance, and also out of things like team decision-making under stress. So some of the examples that I wanted to share with you have some of those characteristics. This last year we built a virtual store for Lowe's, and this is for their associates to use. The whole environment is built in Unity, and there's a series of games that teach you things like being a manager for a day, how to work the cash register, things like that. But you get to build your own avatar in this as you start to create your account, and you can choose, what embodiment you're going to take as a Lowe's associate too. But then as you go in and you're inside of the environment, when you get to certain locations, you're actually confronted by some of the customers. And if you think about it, you're trying to solve a task or do something inside of the environment, and you're getting points for those things that you do. But then when you run across a customer, sometimes they're very aggressive at coming towards you. Where is this? I need to know right now. And you have to address the psychology of that and what that feels like, looks like. When you're in the garden section, you also have to be able to link back to the real world and see where things are inside of that through a mobile app. So it's not always just in the virtual world. You have to be able to make that cognitive leap from inside the world to outside the world, back and forth as you do this. And also working with some of the other employees inside the store. So this is just one quick example. The other thing I was going to show you is something that's actually had some good outcomes research. This is for a course, Accounting 101 at UCF. Dr. Stephen Hornick uses Second Life to teach. And if you've seen what's gone on at UCF, we've gone from this class having about 200 students per cohort to 800 students per cohort. But yet at the same time, if you see down at the bottom of the screen, the performance using the virtual world with avatars has increased by a letter grade. And this is a weed out course, so that's from a high F, low D to a passing C. Because of the use of avatars, because they're embodying and getting access to this knowledge, being able to manipulate some of the knowledge with manipulatives. You can see the account balances going up and down the side there too. The other thing that we did was we built this framework so that the professors and TAs who are having to live in Second Life, but that many students, they could be on all hours of the day. We made an interface that involved two things. One, instead of a guidepost or a signpost, we had an embodied non-player character avatar that had a rote script of all the frequently asked questions. The first thing is we were able to reduce the number of questions from 540 down to 277 actionable requests to either the teaching assistant or to the faculty. So that was item one. When there was a question that the avatar couldn't answer, though, we built a gateway. That gateway went out to the actual instructor's mobile device, either as a text message or email, whichever they preferred, and they could then answer that question and have it sent through the gateway and be either chatted or vocalized out as text to speech, speech to text inside of that non-player character avatar. If it was still yet too complex, where they needed to go and be the guided experiential learning guide on the side and take them to the location on the island that they needed to go to, they could actually go in and just take them to that next place, and manually kind of walk them over. So if they were on the island, they could go and be a tour guide at that point. But they'd say, be there in 20 seconds. And that would cue them that the actual faculty's avatar is going to come in and work with them, one-on-one personalized education. So you can see how some of those things would generate higher scores, maybe not just no significant difference, but actually have an educational outcome. The example you see here is an example of a final exam. You have a script of things you have to do. And you're going to be delivering some of those things and that script as you go through this environment, interacting with other avatars and having to manipulate the environment. Sometimes these things also have to be embodied in mobile devices, but the same thing. What happens when you lose the avatar and lose that sense of embodiment? In some cases, the students like it better. There's fewer impediments to getting into the actual learning. Something to think about as well, too. The last thing I wanted to do is just kind of maybe challenge an assumption, too, and reinforce one. One of them I want to reinforce is we've been using a lot of 2D avatars. This is for Avon. And if you think about Farmville, you have a little 2D avatar, kind of the same type of model here. It's not as much of a 3D embodiment or place in space, but it does give you some of those elements. And you can go and customize them and use this for, in this case, like sales training. And we've also done the same thing for NASA for mission rehearsal, too. We just won a large contract with the University of Colorado to look at deep space missions. And coincidentally, some of the psychology that teams like Eduardo Salas' team are doing at UCF is to see what happens when you have long-duration space missions and have avatars play out so that the people aren't actually going to kill each other by the time they reach 18 months of duration in space. One of the other challenges I want to make is that the components of the avatar in 3D that you talk about fidelity are important in healthcare. You know, we heard Bruce talk about, well, maybe they're not. He and I had a discussion right after, and it's like, well, yeah, I think they still are in certain cases. We have a whole virtual family that people track over the course of their 4 years of medical education with 20 years of medical history. We can time compress. And we're able to kind of go through and have all sorts of traumatic events happen to them. We've dubbed them the sickest family in Central Florida. And they're mapped into 34 curriculum points. But we've been able to make those avatars sometimes just by making them in custom form. But more recently, we've been using 3D scanning capabilities to really get that cost down and have something that is scientifically and medically accurate to the person. 3 passes of scan, and you've got their actual face. You apply that to their body and their body type. You can even do a gait analysis. And you can even scan the inside of their body as well, too, and with MRI technology. But when you do that, you can actually go in and look at the way that those avatars are being embodied, too. And if you see here, this shows some of the scanning process for actual standardized patients. So what we're seeing happen is that the virtual patients, when they look almost exactly like the standardized patient, are treated differently, sometimes treated better, treated with more respect. And if you look at this, you can see the 2 photographs on the bottom. He actually has had a stroke, patient B, for his privacy. Avatars need to have privacy. He's actually had a stroke, and he comes in as a standardized patient because he is a past stroke victim. But he has very distinct characteristics of his face and some of the things that he has. Others have other characteristics, too, that show their disease state physically. And these are where fidelity becomes important. All 3 of these avatars were created in a 1 4-hour session. So it doesn't have to take forever. Just take 2 or 3 weeks each one to do this and to have those come up. Then we can also, you see that as well, but tie into the inside of the body. What happens when you go inside of an avatar's body? You know, those are some of the questions that I thought might provoke some quick response. So with that, I'll leave it, but just wanted to kind of give you that visual tour that might provoke some other questions or thoughts from you guys.
Thanks, David. It's just awesome to see all those examples. I think that we're already developing some key takeaways. Perhaps there is an avatar psychology and it's tied directly to us. And if it's not tied directly to us, then how can we manage it so it affords us certain advantages in the virtual environment? Secondly, I think that one of the things that is almost a call to action is that we need to be thinking about representing ourselves inside of the internet in some way that's consistent. How many logins do you have, and how many different ways do you have? Oh my gosh, you're not on my Facebook page. Oh, I don't have you on Google Groups. I mean, it's getting ridiculous. So we need something that is kind of a pulled together force, a registry, if you will, of who you are as an avatar. And when we say avatar, think broadly now. We know about the anthropomorphic version of your avatar, but now we mean all of you and how you represent that. And then the last question is how much of this can we really use to have effective learning changes in the environment? What I think gamification is really doing is saying, if you are aggregated as a single avatar, perhaps I can start measuring your performance now. what I've really been doing almost before is measuring your behavior, making sure you can click, you can navigate, and you can communicate. But rarely have I asked you to perform. And that's what I think we're going to be doing. How about some concluding remarks from you?
I think probably concluding, I would say that we need to be thinking about avatars more broadly, just like Randy was saying. I think we sometimes think too narrowly about what an avatar is, and it's clearly this anthropomorphic representation of a real person, and so it should get all the stuff that we normally get. I'll tell you a story a little bit actually, and it's partly inspired by Randy's initial question about how you represent yourself in a space. We were building an environment in Second Life to teach about PTSD, and we had a visitor come through and say, "I noticed you've got an awful lot of stairs here and no ramps." And I was like, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, what about all the disabled people?" And I gotta tell you, my initial reaction was, "Are you freaking kidding me?" Because I was like, "Look, this is Second Life. You can fly, and if you're in a wheelchair, it's because you chose to be there." And this is an avatar walking around as just any other able-bodied person. They said, "No, you need to be more considerate of those that are disabled." And I thought, well, that's really weird. Why do I need to accommodate somebody's intentional choice? If somebody is in that environment in a wheelchair, it's because they put it there, right? And even if they are sitting in a wheelchair in their avatar, can't they just push the F button or the page up button and just get up to that next level that they need to go to? Now, I got to say that that was a rather arrogant way to think about it, to be honest, because my first reaction was just like, "You have got to be kidding me. We're almost done, and I'm not going to redesign this." Now, it came out that the person I was talking to was actually quite an advocate for disabled rights in the functional world, the physical world, and she actually too herself suffered from some disabilities, and for her it was actually a real kind of interface thing for her, that when she was in a virtual environment, she represented herself as everyone else, but it really turned into an issue for her. She would get violently dizzy and have some very difficult, that's what I'm looking for. Disorientation when the camera would bounce a little bit. So just having her avatar walk up and down stairs actually made the picture bounce until she got dizzy and sick. And the ramps would actually help her. Now, it kind of opened my eyes a little bit, because I'm thinking, look, we've got to meet people where they're at and how they're coming to us. We might set up these great environments and these great experiences and these great interactions, and if we're assuming that people are showing up to us in a place or in a state or a situation, in a particular one, then we may be actually off the mark. We have to consider who's coming to interact with us. If we're designing the virtual environment or the experience, we have to think about that. So it wasn't just the fact that people might be showing up to our PTSD island actually in the middle of a crisis and anxious and need to talk to somebody about possibly hurting themselves. We had to be thinking more broadly about that. And so it's not just that the avatar is a cursor, or that the avatar is a document, or the avatar is just this thing that represents where they happen to be looking. It actually can be an extension of who they are, and it really impacts their experience. So I guess that would be my takeaway, concluding remark is, design from the perspective of who you're coming to, or think about those experiences from the perspective of who might be experiencing it with you.
In honor of the state of Florida for hosting the conference, David.
Yeah, so I think that as time goes on, this will be more and more of an important issue, because as we take on more physical attributes within these avatars, we're going to have to think about this more and more, the psychological effect of that. For instance, right now, some of the research that we're watching very closely has to do with if your avatar actually has a name associated with it. Of course, we have HIPAA rights, things like that too, that have to trickle down to the virtual environment. But more so, when you start taking blood pressure from a physical person and it actually affects the avatar, or let's use a different example, the Army PT test, whatever your scores are on that, that's what your avatar can do. And that's what they're trying to start to embody in there. Those start to be actual physical characteristics that are taking shape on your physical presence of your avatar in virtual world, and then will also have a psychological effect on those around you, your interaction, and even what your abilities are. You won't be able to run as far as the super avatars we have now when they're tied to your actual Army PT test. Those are things that are coming in the future of fidelity that people don't think about when they just think about the visual fidelity that we showed today. There's actual temporal fidelity. There's other types of physicality in terms of capabilities and attributes, some that are invisible.
And in conclusion, I'd like to thank David Metcalf from the University of Central Florida, Kevin Holloway from the Center of Deployment Psychology, and of course Ashley Medford from Immersive Environments and all their avatars. Thank you very much.